A millionaire abandons his wife and hires a nanny to take care of his sick child. Suspecting the nanny, he installed a security camera, and upon reviewing the footage, he couldn't believe what the nanny was doing to his child. Janitor, a powerful businessman, stood by the large window of his mansion, watching the relentless rain pour over the garden. The opulent residence, which had once symbolized his success, now felt like a cold, empty place. The gray curtains of rain seemed to reflect the despair building inside him. Despite everything he had achieved in life, none of it made sense now as he faced the greatest crisis of his existence. The soft but persistent cries of his newborn son broke the silence of the mansion, reminding him of the reality he couldn't escape. His little boy, so fragile and vulnerable, was battling an illness that doctors couldn't fully explain. A strange genetic condition, a curse passed down through his own bloodline, threatened to take his life before it had even truly begun. Janitor felt a mix of guilt and fear, knowing that the wealth and power he had amassed couldn't save his son. Carla, his wife, had left him shortly after the baby was born. Her departure had been as abrupt as it was painful, leaving him alone with a sick infant and a shattered heart. Carla's infidelity, followed by her cold farewell, had broken what was left of their marriage. Every corner of the mansion reminded him of lost love, broken promises, and the loneliness that now consumed him. In the midst of his despair, Janitor had hired Victoria, a woman who seemed to be the answer to his prayers. From the moment he saw her, something in her eyes made him pause. There was a sadness in her gaze that he couldn't ignore, a deep pain that resonated with his own. Victoria accepted the job as the nanny without hesitation, though Janitor didn't know that she carried her own burden of grief. She had lost her own child at birth, and the pain of that loss still haunted her. Victoria arrived at the mansion with an air of calm that masked her inner turmoil. From the first moment she held the baby in her arms, she felt a deep, almost inexplicable connection. The child, so small and fragile, seemed to fill a void in her heart, a void she had thought could never be filled again. "Are you sure you can handle this?" Janitor asked in a low, almost fearful voice as he watched her cradle his son. Victoria looked up and met his eyes. There was a calmness in her gaze, a determination that unsettled him. "Yes, I am. I'll do everything in my power to take care of him," she replied firmly, without hesitation. Days passed with a heavy, almost suffocating routine. Victoria devoted herself to the care of the baby with a dedication that surprised Janitor, while he sank deeper into despair. The doctors brought no good news, and time seemed to be running out. Each new day heightened the uncertainty and fear. One afternoon, driven by fear of the unknown and the growing distrust that Carla had planted in his heart, Janitor decided to install security cameras in the mansion. He didn't tell Victoria. It was his way of ensuring everything was under control, that there wouldn't be any more surprises that would break him as his wife's betrayal had. The cameras were discreetly hidden in key spots around the mansion, covering every corner where Victoria might be with the baby. Janitor watched the footage from his office, with a mix of guilt and necessity. He didn't want to distrust Victoria, but he couldn't help it. The footage showed Victoria caring for the baby with a tenderness he himself couldn't offer. He watched her rock the baby, whispering soft words to him, and although there was nothing suspicious about what he saw, the tension in his chest wouldn't go away. The days went on, and each time Janitor reviewed the recordings, he couldn't help but feel more uneasy. There was something in the way Victoria looked at the child, something he couldn't decipher. It wasn't just compassion. It was deeper, more intense. It seemed as if the baby was her own flesh and blood, as if every time she held him, she was reclaiming something she had lost. The rain continued to fall, creating a constant backdrop to Janitor's unease. The mansion, with its long hallways and silent rooms, increasingly felt like a prison. Despair mingled with guilt, and guilt with doubt. Was he doing the right thing? Could he truly trust Victoria? Or was he allowing someone else to get too close, only for everything to end in another betrayal? Victoria, for her part, continued her work with a dedication that seemed almost superhuman. She spent hours rocking the baby, whispering lullabies, and caring for him as if her life depended on it. There were nights when Jinri watched her through the cameras, sitting in the rocking chair by the crib, keeping watch over the baby's sleep like a guardian angel. One night, as the storm raged outside, Jinri found himself unable to sleep. The thunder echoed through the mansion, but it wasn't the storm that disturbed his rest. It was the doubts that plagued him. He decided to review the camera footage once more, searching for something, anything that could calm his mind or confirm his fears. The images showed Victoria cradling the baby in her lap, singing softly to him. The scene was peaceful, almost moving, but to Jinri, that peace was tinged with an unease he couldn't understand. He watched how Victoria looked at the child, how her hands held him with a mixture of tenderness and pain. There was something in that gaze that felt strangely familiar, something he couldn't place but that kept him on edge. He closed the recordings and sat in the darkness of his office, listening to the uneven rhythm of his own heartbeat. The shadows in the room seemed denser, more oppressive. Jinri knew he was standing on the edge of an abyss, and soon, he would have to face reality, whatever it might be. What he didn't know was that reality was much closer than he imagined, and what he was about to discover would change his life forever. The mansion, with all its opulence, had become a battleground of emotions. Jinri felt trapped in an endless cycle of doubt and fear, while the figure of Victoria became more enigmatic with each passing day. Who was this woman who had entered his life in its darkest hour? What secrets lay hidden behind that mask of serenity? The answers to those questions were about to be revealed, and when they were, nothing would ever be the same. The rain didn't stop. The drops beat incessantly against the mansion's windows, as if the sky itself was mourning the anguish that permeated within its walls. Jinri hadn't slept all night. The images of Victoria caring for his son kept replaying in his mind. Something about her calm demeanor deeply unsettled him, like a dissonant melody that refused to resolve. Despite the devotion with which Victoria tended to the baby, Jinri couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place, that the fragile balance they lived in was about to break. That morning, the doctors had called with an update on his son's condition. Their voices were grave, laced with a professional detachment that he loathed. The child's illness had progressed, and the only hope was a bone marrow transplant. The words echoed in his ears like a death sentence. Finding a compatible donor was nearly impossible, and every passing minute felt like a step closer to the loss he feared with every fiber of his being. Victoria was in the baby's room when Jinri entered, her face a mask of concentration as she rocked the infant in her arms. Seeing her, a mix of gratitude and distrust washed over him. Despite his fears, he knew Victoria was the only one truly there for his son, sharing with him the weight of their collective desperation. "The doctors say we need a donor," Jinri said, his voice heavy with the desperation he was trying to suppress. Victoria looked up, her eyes reflecting a pain he recognized, a pain that cut through him. "Have they found anyone?" she asked, her tone calm, but the tension in her posture betrayed the concern she felt. Jinri shook his head. No one had been found. The possibility that his son might die before a donor was found struck him with a force that nearly made him collapse. "We can't wait any longer, Victoria. There's no time." The words came out in a whisper, but the urgency in them was unmistakable. Victoria looked down at the baby in her arms, feeling the weight of the responsibility that now rested on them. She knew what it meant not to find a donor in time. The life of that tiny, fragile child hung by a thread, and Jinri, a man who had accomplished the impossible in the business world, was now powerless in the face of the illness ravaging his son. That afternoon, while Jinri was lost in his thoughts, Victoria made a phone call that would change the course of events. She spoke with a trusted doctor, someone she had known for years, and asked him to perform a compatibility test. She didn't tell Jinri. She knew he wouldn't approve of something so impulsive and risky, but deep in her heart, she felt she couldn't stand by and do nothing. The following days were filled with an almost unbearable tension. Janitor continued reviewing the security camera footage, searching for any sign, anything that could explain the growing unease gnawing at him. The mansion, once his sanctuary, now felt like a prison where every corner held a secret he couldn't decipher. One afternoon, as the storm seemed to settle permanently over their heads, Victoria received a call. It was the doctor with the results of the test. Her heart raced as she listened to the words on the other end of the line. She was a match. The possibility of saving Janitor's son lay in her hands, but the price she would have to pay was steep. The procedure to extract the marrow was risky, and the consequences could be permanent. There was a high chance that, after the operation, she would never be able to have children of her own. Victoria sat in silence after hanging up. The decision she had to make was agonizing. The life of a child who wasn't hers, but for whom she had come to feel an indescribable love, now depended on her. She knew that if she told Janitor, he would try to dissuade her, but she couldn't let fear, hers or his, dictate the fate of that little boy. That night, as the storm raged with more intensity than ever, Victoria made the decision not to say anything. Janitor couldn't know what she was planning. While he remained tormented by uncertainty, Victoria prepared herself for what she knew would be her ultimate test. Unable to sleep, Janitor wandered the mansion's hallways like a restless soul. Lightning briefly illuminated the walls, casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The atmosphere was charged with an energy that was almost tangible, as if something terrible was about to happen. When he finally decided to enter his son's room, he found Victoria sitting by the crib, her face bathed in the soft glow of a lamp. "Why don't you try to get some rest?" Victoria suggested, her voice gentle but carrying an authority that Janitor hadn't expected. He looked at her, feeling a strange mixture of emotions that he couldn't articulate. "I can't." That was all he said, but his tone carried the weight of everything left unsaid. Victoria watched him in silence. She knew she should tell him the truth, but at the same time, she feared his reaction. As she looked at him, the decision she had made solidified in her mind. Nothing mattered more than saving that child, even if it meant sacrificing her own future. The following days were a macabre dance of silences and charged glances. Janitor sensed that Victoria was hiding something, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. His mind played tricks on him, filling his thoughts with terrible scenarios he couldn't confirm. Despite his doubts, he clung to Victoria's presence as a lifeline amidst the storm tearing his life apart. The doctor arrived without warning, ringing the doorbell in the midst of the storm. Victoria had called him, and when Janitor saw him, his mind began to piece things together. The expression on the doctor's face wasn't one of someone bringing good news, but rather of someone about to make an impossible request. "What's going on?" Janitor asked, his voice firm but tinged with a fear he couldn't hide. Victoria looked at him with eyes filled with a resolve he didn't understand. "I've found a donor," she announced, but her tone lacked the joy that such news should have brought. Janitor stared at her, confused and alarmed at the same time. "Who? When? How?" His mind raced, trying to grasp what was happening. "It's me, Janitor. I'm a match," Victoria said, and the words struck him like a hammer. The room fell silent, interrupted only by the sound of the wind beating against the windows. Janitor felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. The idea that Victoria, the woman who had been caring for his son with an almost supernatural devotion, was willing to risk her life to save him was something he couldn't fathom. "No, that's not possible. I won't allow it," he finally said, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotions. Victoria stepped closer, her gaze locked onto his. "It's not your decision, Janitor. It's mine, and I've already made it. The silence returned, but this time it was thick with tension, almost unbearable. Jenry searched her eyes for any hint of doubt, something that would tell him he could convince her not to go through with it. But what he found was unwavering resolve, a decision that could not be undone. "Why would you do this?" he finally asked, knowing the question wasn't enough to capture the depth of what he truly wanted to know. Victoria's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the pain she had always kept hidden surfaced. "Because I can't let another child die when I have the power to stop it." Her words hit him like an undeniable truth. Jenry felt something inside him break, but he also understood that he had no right to stop her. Victoria had made her choice, and no matter how much he wanted to, there was nothing he could do to change it. Victoria turned and left the room, leaving Jenry alone with his thoughts. The decision was made, and soon the procedure would take place. The chance to save his son now lay in the hands of a woman who had entered his life in its darkest moment and was willing to sacrifice everything for him. The storm outside the mansion raged on, but inside, a tense calm had settled. Jenry knew that, regardless of the outcome, nothing would ever be the same. The woman who had come into his life as a stranger was now becoming the key to saving the one thing he cared about most in the world. The days that followed passed in a haze of preparations and emotionally charged silences. Victoria, always composed, showed no signs of regret, while Jenry wrestled with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. The operation loomed closer, bringing with it the hope of a future he could not yet foresee. The shadows of the past began to fade, but new ones, darker and deeper, started to emerge, threatening to consume what little remained of them. The morning of the operation arrived with an unsettling calm. The storm that had engulfed the mansion in the previous days had given way to a gray, oppressive sky, as if the world itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to happen. Victoria, in her room, was preparing for what she knew might be the final act of her life as she knew it. She hadn't spoken much with Jenry since revealing her decision, but the silence between them was heavy with unspoken emotions. Jenry walked through the mansion's hallways, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, guilt, and a gratitude he didn't know how to handle. The doctor had arrived early to make the final preparations, and the mansion, usually quiet, was now filled with a tense, silent activity. Jenry knew there was nothing more he could do but wait, but the helplessness was eating away at him. Victoria looked at herself in the mirror, observing her reflection with a calm she didn't feel inside. She had put on a simple, muted white dress that contrasted with the pallor of her face. She knew that what she was about to do would change her life forever. She had accepted the sacrifice it would require, but that didn't make the decision any less painful. She was giving up the chance to be a mother, a dream she had thought lost since the death of her own child, but one that still burned deep within her. Jenry knocked softly before entering Victoria's room. When he saw her standing there in front of the mirror, his heart sank. She met his gaze through the reflection, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and sadness. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, though he knew her answer hadn't changed. Victoria turned to face him, keeping her voice steady. "I am. It's the right thing to do." Jenry nodded, though every fiber of his being wished she would change her mind. The thought of Victoria, who had come to mean so much to him and his son, about to undergo such a dangerous procedure filled him with a terror he could barely control. "I want you to know that. I don't know how to thank you for this," Jenry said, his voice cracking slightly. The words weren't enough to express what he felt, but it was all he had. Victoria gave a faint smile, a gesture that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You don't need to thank me, Jenry. I'm doing this because it's what I must do." She paused, her expression hardening slightly. But there's something else I need you to know before all of this happens. Jenry frowned, feeling a fresh wave of concern. What is it? Victoria took a deep breath, as if preparing for what she was about to reveal. Your son isn't sick just because of a genetic curse. There's something else, something you haven't considered. Jenry looked at her, confused and alarmed at the same time. What are you talking about? Victoria stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. Carla didn't leave just because of her infidelity. There's something much darker behind her departure. Something that involves people who aren't easy to ignore. Jenry's mind began to race, trying to understand what Victoria was implying. People? What are you trying to say? Victoria hesitated for a moment, but she knew she couldn't leave him in the dark. Carla was involved with dangerous people. Drug traffickers, Jenry, people who will stop at nothing to get what they want. She ran because she knew that if she stayed, she would put you and the baby in danger. And that's the real reason your son is sick. Jenry felt as if the ground had opened up beneath him. The revelation hit him with devastating force. Everything he had believed about Carla's departure, about his life, was now shaken. No, that can't be true. His voice was barely a whisper, but the doubt had already taken root in his heart. Victoria watched him, understanding the impact of her words. It is Jenry, and you need to be prepared for what might come next. These people, they don't give up easily. Jenry felt a cold shiver run through his body. His son's life was at stake, but now he realized there were darker forces operating in the shadows. Forces Carla had tried to keep away, even at the cost of abandoning her family. How do you know all this? He finally asked, his mind still struggling to grasp the magnitude of what Victoria had just revealed. Because Carla contacted me before she disappeared. She asked me to take care of your son, to keep him safe. She knew I had my own demons to face, but she also knew I was the only one who could protect him if things got complicated. Victoria let her words hang in the air before continuing. That's why I'm here, Jenry. Not just to save your son's life with this transplant, but to make sure those people don't hurt him. Jenry remained silent, unable to process the mix of emotions flooding him. The gratitude he had felt toward Victoria was now intertwined with a new wave of worry and fear. If Carla had left to protect them, then the threat still loomed, hiding in the shadows. Why didn't you tell me this before? He asked, his voice filled with a mixture of anguish and desperation. Because I didn't want you to be distracted. Your priority has been, and should be, saving your son. And now that you're aware of the situation, I want you to know that you won't be alone in this. Victoria looked him straight in the eye. I'll do everything in my power to protect him, Jenry, even if it means sacrificing what I have left. Victoria's words were a vow, a promise she was ready to fulfill at any cost. Jenry looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, he felt that he wasn't completely alone in his fight. The moment was interrupted by the doctor's arrival, informing them that everything was ready for the operation. Jenry walked with Victoria to the operating room door, each step filled with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. Just before the doors closed behind her, Victoria turned to him one last time. Everything will be fine, Jenry. Take care of him, no matter what happens. And with those words, she disappeared behind the doors, leaving him alone with his thoughts and fears. The operation took place under palpable tension. Jenry couldn't stop thinking about Victoria's revelations, and as he waited outside the operating room, every minute felt like an eternity. The weight of what he had learned crushed him, and the concern for Victoria's and his son's well-being was almost unbearable. Hours later, the doctor emerged to inform him that the operation had been a success. The relief Jenry felt was indescribable, but it didn't last long. When he entered the room to see Victoria, he found her pale and weak, but with a serene smile on her face. You did it, Jenry said. his voice trembling with emotion. But Victoria, her gaze fixed on the ceiling, replied with a calmness that unsettled him. "It's not over, Jenry. This is just the beginning." Victoria's words were ominous, and in that moment, Jenry realized that the shadows looming over his life wouldn't fade with the success of the operation. There were forces at play that he still didn't fully understand, and he knew the real battle was just beginning. In the days that followed, as the child began to show signs of recovery, the mansion took on an air of false tranquility. But Jenry couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was still hovering over them. The memories of Carla, the revelations from Victoria, all of it swirled in his mind, creating an internal storm that gave him no rest. Victoria, recovering slowly, didn't speak much, but her presence remained a pillar of strength. Though her sacrifice had saved the child, Jenry knew she had paid a heavy price. And the thought that dangerous people might be lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike, left him uneasy. The nights were the worst. While the child slept in his crib, Jenry found himself keeping watch over the house, waiting for a danger that had yet to reveal itself. But he knew it was there, lurking, waiting, and he knew he would have to face it, with or without Victoria's help. The apparent peace in the mansion was only a facade, and Jenry, now fully aware of the true nature of the threat they faced, was determined to protect his son at all costs. But deep down, he knew that Victoria's sacrifice had only been the first step in a battle that was far from over. The darkness that had invaded his life wouldn't fade easily, and as the wind whispered through the trees surrounding the mansion, Jenry braced himself for the inevitable. He knew the shadows of the past didn't disappear with time. They only grew denser, more dangerous, and soon, he would have to confront them head-on. The mansion was enveloped in an eerie calm, an unsettling tranquility after the recent events. The gray clouds hung motionless in the sky, as if the storm that had raged in the past days had left a heavy silence in its place. Jenry, exhausted from the constant stress and worry, sat alone in his study, reviewing the security cameras for the umpteenth time. He knew he was becoming obsessed, but the fear of the unknown, the possibility that something else was lurking, drove him to continue. Victoria, after the operation, had retreated to her room to rest. Jenry had noticed a change in her, a shadow in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Although he was filled with gratitude for the sacrifice she had made for his son, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something Victoria was hiding from him. His instincts told him that the calm he felt was only superficial, that something darker was at play. Jenry looked at the screen displaying the baby's room. Victoria was there, sitting by the crib, watching the child with an expression he couldn't decipher. The camera captured every movement, every small gesture, and as Jenry watched, something about the scene seemed strange, out of place. Victoria leaned over the crib, and in an act that completely caught him off guard, she began unbuttoning her blouse. Jenry's heart stopped for a moment. He watched, frozen, as Victoria took the baby in her arms and brought him to her chest. The images didn't make sense. His mind refused to comprehend what he was seeing. Victoria, the nanny he had hired to care for his son, was breastfeeding him. The emotions hit him like an avalanche: confusion, anger, and a deep fear. What did this mean? What was Victoria doing? How could she dare to cross such an intimate boundary without his consent? Panic began to take over, mixed with a sense of betrayal that he couldn't explain. In that moment, he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed to confront her, to get answers. He rose from his chair, almost knocking it over in the process, and stormed out of the study. His footsteps echoed through the empty hallways of the mansion, growing faster, driven by the urgency of the situation. When he reached the baby's room, he pushed the door open forcefully, not caring to be quiet. Victoria looked up as the door burst open. Her face tightened when she saw the expression on Jinri's face, a mixture of fury and desperation. She still held the baby in her arms, her blouse slightly open, but her eyes reflected a combination of pain and resignation. "What are you doing?" Jinri demanded, his voice trembling with the intensity of his emotions. Victoria didn't respond immediately. She had known this moment would come, but she had never imagined it would be so difficult. Gently, she rebuttoned her blouse and placed the baby back in the crib. Then, she turned to face Jinri, her eyes meeting his, knowing that the words she was about to say would change everything forever. "We need to talk," she finally said, her voice calm but tinged with a sadness she couldn't hide. Jinri was breathing heavily, his mind filled with questions, with accusations he didn't know how to voice. But the look in Victoria's eyes, so full of something he couldn't fully comprehend, made him pause. Something was very wrong, and he knew it. "Explain yourself," he said, trying to keep his composure, though his voice was still rough and heavy with tension. Victoria nodded slowly, moving toward a nearby chair and sitting down, as if she needed the support. Jinri remained standing, watching her with a mixture of distrust and confusion. "What you saw, what I did. It's not what you think," she began, and in her words was a promise of truths Jinri wasn't sure he wanted to hear. "This baby isn't what everyone thinks." Jinri's brow furrowed, the confusion on his face deepening. "What are you talking about?" His voice hardened, but there was an underlying tremor, reflecting his fear of what she might say. Victoria looked directly into his eyes, knowing there was no turning back. "This baby isn't yours and Carla's. He's mine." The words hung in the air, like a bomb about to go off. Jinri felt as though his entire world had stopped, that reality itself had shattered before the revelation. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His mind struggled to process what Victoria had just said, to make sense of something that seemed utterly unimaginable. "That's not possible," he began, but his voice was a broken whisper, unable to sustain the disbelief. Victoria nodded slowly, her gaze reflecting the pain of a truth she had kept hidden for too long. "It's the truth, Jinri. I'm the real mother of this child. Carla was never able to have him. She lost her baby at birth, and the pain, the guilt, and the fear of everything she had done led her to make a desperate decision." Jinri took a step back, as if needing physical distance from what he was hearing. How is that possible?" he asked, his voice choked with shock. Victoria lowered her gaze, recalling the moments that had brought her to this point. Moments she had tried to forget, but that were now returning with full force. "Carla was involved with dangerous people, as I told you before. People who wouldn't stop at anything to get what they wanted. When she lost her baby, she realized her life was falling apart, that everything she had built was crumbling. That's when she decided to take the darkest path. She found me at a vulnerable moment, knowing I was pregnant and alone. She threatened me, Jinri. She threatened to destroy my entire family if I didn't accept her deal. She forced me to give birth in secret and then took my baby, telling me I had to pass him off as hers and yours. She said that if I didn't agree, my family would pay the price." Jinri felt his stomach churn. Anger and desperation consumed him, mixed with a sadness so deep he could barely stand it. Carla, his wife, the woman he had shared his life with, had woven a web of lies and betrayal so vast and dark that he couldn't fully comprehend it. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, even though he knew there was no answer that could ease the pain he felt. Victoria looked at him, her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Because I was afraid of what might happen if I did. I knew Carla still had power, that the people she was involved with wouldn't stop at anything to get what they wanted. But I couldn't keep living this lie, not after everything that's happened. I couldn't do it anymore." Jenry, I can't keep pretending this child isn't mine. The silence that followed was overwhelming, broken only by the soft sound of the baby breathing in his crib. Jenry felt that everything he had built, everything he had believed in, was crumbling before his eyes. The woman he had loved, the woman he had believed was the mother of his child, had been the architect of a lie so colossal it now crushed him under its weight. So, Carla, he began, trying to find some logic in all of this. Was all of this just to protect her own lie? Victoria nodded slowly, her expression full of pain. Yes, but it's not just about the lie, Jenry. There's more at stake. These people, the ones who pressured her, won't stop until they get what they want. And what they want is power. Power they believe this child can give them. That's why she threatened me. Why she made me pretend to be the nanny, to keep the lie safe, to keep her position safe. But now that you know the truth, I fear the consequences will be devastating. Jenry felt the air leave his lungs, as if the revelation had uprooted everything that kept him standing. He knew he could no longer trust anything he thought he knew. The woman he had loved had deceived him, and the child he had sworn to protect was another's, a child born of a lie. But what hurt him most was the realization that Victoria, the woman who had shown such deep love and made such a great sacrifice, was the true mother. Everything he had felt for his son, all the devotion he had seen in her, now made new sense. She had suffered in silence, out of fear, for her family's safety, for the protection of a life that had been taken from her. What do we do now? He finally asked, his voice filled with a desperation he couldn't hide. Victoria stepped closer to him, her hand trembling slightly as she placed it on his. The first thing we need to do is protect our child. Because regardless of everything, that's what he is. Our child. Victoria's words hung in the air, full of renewed strength. And then, we'll face these people, together. I can't do this alone anymore, Jenry. I need us to fight for him, for us. Jenry looked at her, his heart shattered. But in the midst of that devastation, he found a spark of determination. He knew he had been deceived, that his life had been torn apart by lies. But he also knew Victoria was by his side, ready to fight for what was right, for what they loved. I won't let them hurt him, or either of you, he finally said, his voice firm, though a single tear slid down his cheek. Victoria nodded, her own eyes filled with tears that she finally let fall. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. The two stood there in silence, determined to face what was coming. They knew the fight would be hard, that the shadows of the past still loomed over them, but they also knew they were in this together. And that, at least for now, was enough. The mansion, with all its luxury and grandeur, had become a place of revealed truths, of promises made in the midst of a storm that had only just begun. And as the baby slept peacefully, unaware of the turmoil around him, his parents, the true ones, prepared for what lay ahead, because the real enemy was still out there, waiting, and they knew that only together could they face him. The lies that had poisoned their lives were out in the open, and with them, the possibility of a new beginning, a beginning forged in truth, in bravery, and in a love that refused to give up. The chapter closed with the promise of a battle ahead, a battle for the truth, for justice, and for the future of a family that had been born in darkness, but was now ready to fight for the light. The mansion, which had witnessed so many secrets and betrayals, was now steeped in a tense silence, heavy with emotion. The revelations that had come to light had changed everything, and the air was thick with the fragility that accompanies the truth when it's finally exposed. Jenry, standing by his son's crib, couldn't take his eyes off the child he had come to love more than his own life. Though the reality was painful, he knew in his heart that nothing would change that love. Victoria, sitting in the room, silently watched Jinri as he gazed at the baby. The words she had spoken just hours earlier still echoed in both their minds, and though the weight of the truth was almost unbearable, there was also a sense of relief in no longer having to live in a lie. After a long pause, Jinri broke the silence between them. "It doesn't matter what happened or what brought us here," he said in a voice firm but laden with emotion. "This child is mine, Victoria. He always will be. I've raised him as my son, and that won't change. I won't let anyone take him from me, and I won't let anything or anyone hurt him." Victoria looked at him, her eyes filled with tears she hadn't let fall. She knew Jinri was struggling to accept everything he had learned, but his words reassured her that his love for the child hadn't faltered. That love, pure and selfless, was what drove him to keep moving forward, to fight for what he now knew was truly his family. "Thank you, Jinri," Victoria replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I know this is hard to accept, but I promise you, I never wanted things to get to this point. Everything I did was to protect our child. But I know we can't keep running from the truth." Jinri nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the decisions he now had to make. He knew the revelations didn't end here, that there were still secrets to uncover, and that the past Carla had left behind was still a looming threat. Before they could continue, the sound of footsteps in the hallway alerted them. The door slowly creaked open, and Carla appeared in the doorway, her face etched with guilt and exhaustion. Her eyes met Jinri's and Victoria's, and for a moment, it seemed as if the weight of everything she had done was crushing her. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jinri looked at her, feeling a mix of emotions he couldn't untangle. The love he had once felt for Carla was now tainted with betrayal, but also with compassion. He knew she carried her own burden of pain and guilt, and that facing her wouldn't be easy for either of them. Carla stepped into the room, keeping her distance, as if she feared coming too close. "There are things I haven't told you. Things you need to know," she began, her voice shaky. "For a long time, I tried to justify my actions, telling myself I was doing the right thing, that everything was to protect my family. But the truth is, I was running from my own mistakes." Jinri looked at her harshly, but said nothing, allowing her to continue. "When I found out I was pregnant, I thought the baby would be the solution to all my problems, that I could hold on to him and escape the life I was living. But everything became more complicated when I got involved with dangerous people. People who only wanted to take advantage of me, of what I could offer them. And of you, Jinri." Carla paused, searching for the right words. "I started a relationship with a man, a mobster. He's the one who promised me protection, who told me he could help me keep everything I'd built with you. But in return, I had to give him information about your business, about your finances." Victoria felt her heart race upon hearing Carla's confession. She knew things had been bad, but she hadn't imagined how far they had gone. "All of this was for money?" Jinri asked, his voice low and full of disbelief. "You were willing to sacrifice your family for money?" Carla closed her eyes, a solitary tear rolling down her cheek. "At first, I thought I could control it, that I just needed to get through it, get what I wanted, and then walk away. But it wasn't like that. The more I got involved, the harder it was to escape. And when I lost the baby, it felt like everything I had built collapsed. It was my fault, all of it. The stress, the guilt, the life I was living. It made me lose him. And at that moment, I knew there was no going back. All I could do was hold on to you, Jinri, and try to keep up appearances, to protect the little I had left." Victoria looked at her with a mixture of compassion and sadness. "And that's why you forced me to give up my child?" she asked, her voice soft but full of pain. "Because you were afraid of losing everything?" Carla nodded, her gaze filled with regret. "I couldn't bear the thought of my whole world falling apart. I thought if I had a child, I could keep you by my side, Jinri, and get away from that life. But when I lost him, I knew I had ruined everything. So I found you, Victoria, and I threatened you because it was the only way I had to keep what I thought I needed. It was a terrible mistake, and now I see I can't keep running from it. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken emotions and wounds that had yet to heal. Jinri, feeling the magnitude of everything that had happened, knew it was time to make a decision. Carla, I can't forgive you for what you did, he said finally, his voice firm but full of sadness. But I can't hate you either. I know you were lost, trapped in a life you couldn't control. What you did was wrong, and the consequences of your actions have been devastating. But I don't want you to keep running. It's time to face what you've done, to accept the consequences. Carla nodded, her eyes filled with tears. I know, Jinri. I'm ready. I don't want to keep living this lie. I'm tired of running. Victoria, who had remained silent while watching the interaction between them, decided to step in. There's something else you need to know, Jinri. Despite everything that's happened, the most important thing now is to protect our son. We can't let these people use him as a pawn in their game. We need to leave here and find somewhere safe. Jinri nodded, knowing Victoria was right. They had uncovered the truth, but the threat was still present, and they couldn't afford to let their guard down. You're right, Victoria. But before we do anything, we need to make sure we're prepared for what's coming. Carla, can you give us more information about these people? Is there anything we can use to keep them at bay? Carla thought for a moment before responding. I know some of their weaknesses, and I know there are people within the organization who might be willing to betray them if we offer them enough. But it will be risky. They won't stop at anything to protect their interests. Jinri nodded, knowing they didn't have another choice. Then that's what we'll do. We're not going to sit here and wait for them to find us. We're going to get ahead of them, use what we know to gain an advantage, and make sure they can't hurt us. Victoria looked at him, a spark of hope in her eyes. We're in this together, Jinri. No matter what happens, we'll fight as a family. For the first time in a long time, Carla felt a glimmer of relief. She knew she had made unforgivable mistakes, but she also knew she now had the chance to redeem herself, to do the right thing for the first time in a long time. Thank you, Jinri. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll do whatever it takes to protect you and the child. I can't undo what I did, but I can help make it right. The plan quickly began to take shape. They knew they had to act quickly and with precision. Carla provided key information about the mafia organization's finances and contacts, and with that information, Jinri started to formulate a plan to counter the threat. They decided to contact people within the organization who might be willing to betray their leaders in exchange for security and money. As they prepared to leave the mansion, the atmosphere was filled with a mixture of tension and hope. They knew they were walking a very thin line, but they also knew they couldn't give up. Jinri, Victoria, and Carla united as a broken family, but one determined to fight for their future. Over the following hours, they managed to establish contacts and build a network of allies who provided valuable information and the promise of help. They knew it wouldn't be easy, that there were still many battles ahead, but they also knew they were more prepared than ever to face them. Finally, with everything ready, they left the mansion that had witnessed so many lies and betrayals. With the child in his arms, Jinri looked back one last time, knowing they were leaving behind a life of pain, but also with the hope of a new beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were in this together, and that gave them the strength to move forward. As they drove away, Jinri held the child close to his chest, promising himself that he would do whatever it took to protect his son, his real son, and ensure that the darkness of the past would never catch up to them again. The escape from the mansion had only been the first step in a series of decisions that would define the future of Jinri, Victoria, and Carla. With the child safe for the moment and having created a network of contacts willing to help them, they knew they couldn't keep running forever. The mobsters, whose shadow loomed over them, remained a real threat, and Jenry understood that the only way to end this nightmare was to confront them directly. Carla, consumed by guilt and remorse, knew that her life had reached a turning point. She could no longer run from the consequences of her actions, and the weight of her betrayal crushed her more each day. She had lost Jenry's trust, endangered the lives of her own child and Victoria, all because of selfish decisions driven by fear and greed. One night, while Victoria and Jenry discussed their next steps, Carla, her voice trembling but determined, approached them. "I've made a decision," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jenry looked at her, maintaining an emotional distance that reflected everything that had happened between them. "What decision?" he asked, without looking away. Carla took a deep breath before speaking. "I can't keep living with this. The mobsters who have been hunting us, who have made our lives a living hell, they are threatening to kill us if I don't meet their demands. I can't let this continue. I've already done too much damage, and it's time for me to face the consequences of my actions." Victoria, though surprised, felt a spark of hope in Carla's words. She knew that the only way to dismantle the criminal network that hunted them was from the inside, and Carla was the key. "What are you saying?" Jenry asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and concern. "I'm going to turn myself into the police," Carla responded, her eyes full of determination. "I'll tell them everything. I'll reveal every secret, every contact, every detail about the mobsters. I'll tell them where they are, how they operate, everything I know. And in exchange, I'll try to ensure that both of you are safe, that the child is safe. I know this won't fix what I've done, but it's the only thing left for me to do." Jenry remained silent, processing what Carla had just said. He knew this was the right thing, but he also knew that this decision came from a broken woman, trying to find some form of redemption amidst the chaos she had created. "Are you sure this is what you want to do?" he finally asked, his tone softer. Carla nodded without hesitation. "There's no other option, Jenry. I've made too many mistakes, and it's time to pay for them. I can't keep running. It's time to face the truth, no matter the consequences." Victoria approached Carla, feeling a wave of compassion for the woman who had once been her enemy and now, perhaps, her ally. "If you do this, you might never get out of prison," Victoria warned her, though she knew Carla had already considered this. "I know," Carla replied, her voice firm, "but I'd rather face that than keep living with the guilt and fear that have consumed me. Besides, it's the only way to ensure that you are safe. If I turn myself in, if I cooperate with the police, I can make sure those men end up behind bars where they can't hurt anyone else." Jenry finally nodded. He knew this was the right thing to do, but he also knew there was no turning back for Carla. What she was about to do was an act of redemption, but it couldn't erase the past. "All right, Carla. If this is what you've decided, we'll support you in whatever you need," said Jenry, though his tone reflected the distance that still existed between them. Carla appreciated Jenry's words, though she knew there was no place for her in his life anymore. The love they had once shared had crumbled under the weight of lies and betrayals, and she didn't expect to recover it. The next day, Carla turned herself in to the police. She was received by agents who had been investigating the mafia organization for years, and the information she provided proved to be the key piece they needed to dismantle the criminal network. Carla revealed all the secrets, all the connections, all the names. Every detail she had hidden for so long was now exposed to the light, and with it, the mafia's empire began to crumble. Authorities acted quickly, carrying out raids and arrests that culminated in the capture of the organization's leaders. The mobsters who had threatened Carla, Jenry, and Victoria were put behind bars, facing charges that ensured they would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Carla's sacrifice had paid off. She had protected her family, destroyed the criminal network that had trapped her, and found a way to redeem herself, though she knew the price would be steep. Days later, in a cold interrogation room, Carla sat across from an officer, waiting for her fate. She knew that despite her cooperation, she would have to pay for her crimes. But she no longer cared. What hurt her the most was the distance that now existed between her and Janitor, the man she had once loved and betrayed. When she was finally brought to trial, Carla pleaded guilty to all charges against her. The judge, considering her cooperation, offered her a reduced sentence, but she knew she would spend many years in prison. She accepted her fate with dignity, knowing it was the price of her actions. Before being transferred to prison, Carla asked to see Janitor one last time. She knew it was a risk, that he might refuse, but she needed to try to close that chapter of her life. Janitor agreed to see her, though he knew the conversation would be difficult. When they met in the prison's visitation room, the atmosphere was filled with a mixture of nostalgia and sadness. Janitor, Carla began, her voice soft. I want to thank you for everything you've done, for giving me the chance to redeem myself. I know I've destroyed what we had, but I want you to know that I will always love you. Janitor looked at her, his expression serious but without a trace of anger. Carla, what you did was unforgivable. You destroyed our life, our family. But I also know that you did the right thing in the end, and that's something I can't ignore. I'm grateful for what you did to protect us, but I can't go on with this. I can't trust you again, not after everything that's happened. Carla felt the tears well up in her eyes, but she nodded, accepting the truth. I understand, Janitor. I didn't expect anything else. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, that I truly am sorry for everything. Janitor nodded, his heart heavy with everything they had been through. I wish you the best, Carla. I hope you find the peace you're looking for. But my life is with Victoria and our child now. I can't go back to the past, and I can't move forward with you. Janitor's words were harsh, but also filled with a compassion Carla hadn't expected. She knew he had made the right decision, and though it hurt, she also felt a strange sense of relief. Now, she could leave the past behind and face her future, whatever it might be. Janitor stood up to leave, and for a moment, Carla wanted to stop him, to beg him to stay. But she knew that would only prolong the pain. Instead, she simply watched him walk away, knowing it was the last time she would see him. When the door closed behind him, Carla allowed the tears to finally fall. She knew she had lost everything, but she also knew she had done the right thing. Now, her only wish was to find a way to redeem herself, even if it had to be from within the prison walls. Janitor, for his part, left the prison with a mix of relief and sadness. He knew he had done the right thing by letting Carla go, but he also knew he would always carry the scars of what they had been through. Now, his focus was on his son, on Victoria, and on building a new life free from the shadows of the past. He returned home, where Victoria was waiting for him, her face serene but concerned. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice full of care. "Hard, but necessary," Janitor responded, letting out a sigh. "It's the end of an era, Victoria. Now we can start fresh, without lies, without fear." Victoria smiled softly, knowing there was still much work to be done, but also knowing they were on the right path. "I'm here with you, Janitor. I always will be. And together, we'll do whatever it takes to protect our family." Janitor nodded, taking her hand firmly. "Thank you, Victoria. I don't know what I would have done without you." The couple stood there, at the entrance to their home, feeling the weight of everything they had lived through. But they also felt the hope of a better future, one in which they could build something real and lasting. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face it together, with truth on their side and love as their guide. The story concludes with a sense of closure and redemption. Though the scars of the past would remain, Jinri and Victoria had decided to face the future with courage and determination. Carla, for her part, found her own path to redemption, accepting the consequences of her actions and seeking a way to rebuild her life from scratch. Life had given them a second chance, and they were determined to make the most of it. What did you think of this story? Let us know in the comments. What would you do in a similar situation? We invite you to like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends or family as a way to show your support. This motivates us to keep bringing you exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We truly value having you here with us. You can click on the links now appearing on your screen. We have an exclusive selection of captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. Take care.